Shabbat Shalom. Well, as many of you know, I recently came back from a short visit to England, and it was a pretty eventful trip, one way or the other. Just before I left, I heard that my teacher, Professor Rabbi, had been admitted to hospice at the age of 92. I was able to visit him twice in the 10 days or so that I was there, and on the day that he left the world, I was at his bedside. And I was able to attend both his funeral and the first night of his shiva before returning here. And Raphael forbade any eulogy at his funeral, and I imagine that I was not the only one sitting there who remembered him telling me that he didn't see any need for a eulogy or indeed for a headstone on his grave because Moses never had either, so why should he get them? And in line with the great traditions of Judaism, I would like to take issue with my teacher. And I would like to adduce this week's Torah portion as evidence that a eulogy is indeed appropriate, and so is a headstone. A little further on from the passage that Mika read so beautifully to us, we find an episode which, if we read it with the full respect and dedication that Raphael taught me is appropriate when we're studying a passage of Torah, it will tell us a good deal about one of the main protagonists of Torah. I'm talking, of course, about Moses. And if you would like to follow, you don't have to, but if you would like to follow, you'll find it in the Red Book on page 834. And it begins at verse 6. And in that passage, it's only 3 verses long, God is reproving Moses and Aaron for speaking out against, reproving Miriam and Aaron for speaking out against Moses. And in it, God explains to them exactly what it is about Moses that makes Moses quite so special. And in the translation that you've got in the Red Book, this little passage reads, this is God speaking, "Hear these my words. When a prophet of the Lord arises among you, I make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. Not so my servant Moses. He is trusted throughout my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth, plainly and not in riddles, and he beholds the likeness of the Lord. How then did you not shrink from speaking against my servant Moses?" And I suggest that the first thing we want to notice about this piece is that it is a little piece of poetry. The climax of the poem is in the middle, in verse 7, and the other content is arranged around it, inviting us to compare and contrast the beginning and the end, verse 6 with verse 8. This is something that the Torah enjoys doing, and so do the prophets, and you find it all over the Hebrew Bible. So you have a center, and then you have an outside and an outside that bookend, as it were, that are somehow intended to match up with each other. And the center of the poem, I think, is clear enough. Moses is trusted by God. Moses is God's faithful servant. It's as if Moses belongs in God's household. But the outside verses aren't as clear. So in order to understand it better, and in honor of my teacher, I would like to teach you to look at these verses in the way that if he were here, and indeed in a way he is in me, he would invite you to read them. And the first thing he would say is that if you don't understand something, say so. So if it's not understandable, go to people who were more intelligent than you. He would suggest that we go to the traditional commentators, and so let's plug in a traditional understanding here from Ramban, Nachmanides, who says that that first verse is intended to be directed against Miriam and Aaron, and intended to read, if Moses was your prophet. In other words, if Moses was just like you. Understand from this that Moses is not just like you. You too are inferior to Moses in just the way that Raphael would have us think that we are inferior to the medieval commentators, and we probably are. And therefore, God behaves differently towards Moses. So if God with Miriam and Aaron, makes God's self known in a vision and speaks with them in a dream. When God is dealing with Moses, God speaks mouth to mouth, plainly and not in riddles, while Moses beholds the likeness of the Lord. Okay, so we understand the structure and we probably understand the separate words, but I don't know if you, as I, at this point was still unclear as to what those words really mean. And for that, we need to use another technique that my teacher taught me. We need to really hunker down and look at the Hebrew. And the Hebrew contains a complicated word, and Raphael delighted in complicated words and would settle on them much like a bee settles on a flower and start to mine them. And that word, in this context, is the word temunah. Now, we know what it means in modern Hebrew. In modern Hebrew, the word temunah means picture. Absolutely. But Raphael didn't acknowledge the existence of modern Hebrew, see. He used to joke that he died in 1492, and he would begin by looking at where the word occurs elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. And there are only 8 occurrences of this in the whole Hebrew Bible. And it's a funny old word. And the root isn't clear, but it probably means to split, which is why that word gets translated as meaning likeness. So when God is communicating with Moses, Moses gets to see a split off part of God, whatever that might consist of. And Moses is the only prophet, Moses is the only one for whom God will behave in this way, for whom God will split off a part of God's self and stand and let Moses behold it. But that's not all. God tells us that God communicates with Moses mouth to mouth, and that's really odd. Because wouldn't you expect mouth to ear? When we whisper a secret to somebody, we put our mouth up against their ear. Mouth to mouth suggests something completely different. And I want to suggest that there are 2 concealed messages here. And the first is a nudge about mouths and what mouth means to Moses. Because if you remember way back in the Torah, Moses is the one who tells God, I can't possibly be your messenger because I have a lot of trouble with public speaking. Yeah? The phrase that Moses uses when he says that is ani kvad peh, I'm heavy of mouth. So at that point, God promises that God will be with Moses' mouth. And it's from that moment onwards, I want to suggest that this special relationship between God and Moses of mouth to mouth is set up. And the phrase being used here is evidence that God didn't forget that promise, and that that promise is indeed being kept. And the second is that when you choose the same body part for one person and another person, it suggests a mutuality. God has a mouth. God is being anthropomorphized here, turned into a human being. God has a mouth. Moses has a mouth. Somehow it suggests a relationship of equality. Somehow it suggests that God and Moses are somehow alike. And thus we begin really to understand what it is that was special about Moses, that Moses had that no other prophet did. The first is that Moses saw God's temunah. Moses had the capacity to see God's true reflection, God as God really was. And the second is that Moses and God coexist. It's I would call it a symbiotic relationship. They exist mouth to mouth in a relationship that is as intimate as a kiss. And no other prophet had that relationship with God. No other prophet even began to come close. And so we arrive at the third lesson that Raphael taught me. He taught me that any time you are looking at Torah, every time you make a translation, however good your translation is, however inspired you are, that translation represents a choice that you have made, and by making that choice, you exclude other possible readings of Torah. It's like a sliding doors. You choose one set and not the other. But the other journey doesn't disappear. The other journey, represented by that other translation, continues to exist. This is a big, important thought when it comes to Torah. That for every version, every translation of the Torah that we see, there are countless other versions of Torah existing contemporaneously, as it were, in parallel universes, ready for us to access, waiting for us to translate them and bring them into our reality, waiting for us to create the relationship between ourselves and the text that existed between God and Moses. And so, if we do that with this, the translation of this passage that we have created today says, "Oh, listen to my words. If this was a prophet such as you two are, I would make myself known to him in a vision. I, God, would speak to them in a dream, but my servant Moses is not that way. My servant Moses is trusted in all my household, and with him I speak mouth to mouth, plainly and not in riddles, while he beholds my true reflection." So Moses really is unique. Only Moses gets to perceive the true nature of God. Only Moses gets to share God's secrets. Only Moses is the recipient of direct communication that isn't subject to misinterpretation. And that is what makes Moses so very special. The theme that Moses was unique is going to turn up once more in the Torah. It turns up right at the very, very end, just after we have been told that Moses was buried by God's own hand. And it's in that passage, reading that passage, that Raphael used to adduce that as proof that Moses had no epitaph and no tombstone. And if we consider just that passage, Raphael was absolutely right. But as I said, I take the license, the great Jewish license, to disagree in love and humility and respect with my teacher. I suggest that Moses had not one epitaph, but two. And the first epitaph I want to suggest is precisely the text that we just studied. We know that when people are great, they often prepare their obituaries before they die. They often pre-approve what is going to appear in the columns of a newspaper. If we take that idea and the fact that our teacher Rashi teaches us that there is no chronology in Torah, just because things appear in an order does not mean that that is how they chronologically happened. I want to suggest that these very words that we read this week are Moses' epitaph. And I want to suggest even that Moses and God prepared it together and might even have had a little bit of a confidential laugh about it, hiding it where they thought we wouldn't be able to discover it. But Moses' second epitaph, he has two, stands outside the Torah. I want to suggest that Moses' enduring epitaph, if we can put it that way, is the fact that we are sitting here on a Saturday morning in Los Angeles on an uncharacteristically cloudy day, millennia after this man died, still talking about him, and still wondering about what he was like, and still lifting up the Torah and proclaiming that this is Al Pi Adonai B'yad Moshe, from God's mouth to Moses' hand. We are Moses' epitaph. We, as we walk in the world, as we put into practice our standards and our morals, as we stand and we pray, as we bring up our families, we are a living, three-dimensional epitaph. And for as long as we exist, for as long as we connect ourselves with Moses' story, Moses will not be forgotten. Because you see, the truth is that we exist pe el pe, mouth to mouth. The truth is that we are echo chambers for the words of those we love. dating all the way back to the words that were given us through Torah and adding the words of our parents and our teachers and our friends. Each one of us in this room carries the secrets that were whispered to us by those who were wiser than us, by those who had Torah to transmit to us, by those who no longer walk in the world. And we receive, and we transmit, just as God tells us was the case with Moses. In the Babylonian Talmud, we find the following teaching. Rabbi Yochanan taught that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said that whenever someone repeats Torah that they learned from a teacher who has died, that teacher's lips whisper in the grave. Every time we repeat what we learned from those we loved, they too whisper, mouth to mouth. We are the mouths of those who we love when their mouths can no longer speak in this world. And so there is never, ever any such thing as the last word. You didn't know Raphael Lowy, Raphael ben Mordechai Tzvi Halevi, but you know me. And through me, you see, you know him. And today I hope that his lips are whispering. Shabbat Shalom.